I like to discuss topics related to infrared photography. In this video, I'll review the biggest change to Lightroom Classic version 10, color grading. There's a variety of new quality of life features in version 10, but the biggest new feature is the color grading panel, which replaces the split toning panel. I'll explain what color grading is, review the new color grading panel in depth, and talk about the one feature that's still missing. At the end of the video, I'll show you some examples of color grading with infrared images. First off, what is color grading? Color grading is where you change the colors by adding colors to the shadows, midtones, or highlights to create a cinematic look. So for example, in this image, I could take this properly white balanced image, and if I apply a color grade to it, it adds a different mood, a different feel to it. To better understand what color grading is, let's apply some of the effects to this black and white gradiated image. So in Lightroom, I'm in the develop module, and I will go to the color grading panel and open that up. And the first thing I'm going to do is go down to shadows, and I'm going to take the shadows and I'm going to drag it down into this blue range that exists over here. And you can see when I do that I'm getting the darker tones in this image are being changed. There's a blue color being added to them. Notice it's not affecting the darkest blacks as much because there's so little color in the blacks. You can't really add much color to that. And it's having a very small effect on the midtones, and it's having almost no effect on the highlights. So that's what happens when I attack the shadows. Now, when I do the same with the highlights, if I grab the circle here and I drag it up into the yellow, you'll see the same thing. I have the yellow color is affecting the highlights, so we're getting a little bit of effect in the midtones, and it's having almost no effect in the brightest part of the image because there's no color there to add to. Now, if we go to the midtones and create a midtone, we'll do a green midtone here. The green color is impacting predominantly the midtones of the image, bleeding a little bit into the highlights, but then it drops off and doesn't affect all the highlights. And the same thing in the shadows. It's bleeding into the shadows and doesn't have as much of an effect in the shadows. So that should give you an idea of what will happen when you want to apply a color grade to one of your images. Color grading is technically very similar to color balance or color correction, which are used to correct the colors in an image. So I'm here in Photoshop. We've got this same grayscale image loaded up. If I add an adjustment layer down in the lower right-hand corner and I select color balance, to add that adjustment layer, this will bring up the color balance tool. The format is a little bit different, but it has the same functionality. So I can choose the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights. And then with each of those, I can select the colors. So if I want to go to the shadows and make the shadows blue, you can see that we're having the same effect. The blue color is starting to affect the darker tones of the image, but it doesn't have much of an impact on the blackest tones, and then it fades off as it gets to the midtones and doesn't appear in the highlights. If we go to the highlights, make the highlights yellow, we'll see a similar effect where the brighter tones are being colored yellow, but the brightest tones not having much of an impact, and it bleeds off into the midtones, and then the yellow has no effect on the darkest tones. And then if we go to the midtones and add some midtones, you'll see a similar effect to what we saw in Lightroom. That green color is being added to the midtones, but it falls off into the highlights and falls off into the shadows. So color balance that's available in Photoshop is very similar to color grading, but the tools are different because you're using these sliders. And in fact, I think it's more limiting than the circles, which will give you a lot more control. But essentially, color grading and color balance are two ways of accomplishing the same thing. All right, so let's dive into some of the details on the color grading panel. So as I mentioned earlier, the color grading panel replaces the split toning panel that existed in earlier versions of Lightroom. The split toning only supported shadows and highlights. It did not have a midtone. And so that's one of the new features of this color grading is that it has midtones, and it also has a global setting, so you can set a tone globally. So you can use color grading to enhance or add colors to an image, or you can use it to actually subtract colors from an image. And I'll show you how to do that a little bit later. So if we look up at the top of the color grading panel, there's three sets of tools. The first is the three-way. This is what shows us the midtones, the shadows, and the highlights all on one screen. Next up, we can see individual versions of these where we have a little bit more control because the circle is bigger. We have shadows, we have midtones, and we have highlights. You can also click off to the side here to jump between them, or you can click on the top panel to the top of the panel to select between them either way. And finally, we have a global option where we can make a change to the entire image. So there's lots of ways that you can control the color in color grading. So let's review some of those. So if I grab this circle in the middle and drag it around, you can see the impact that it's going to have on the image. If I rotate around the image, then it's going to change the hue. So the direction that I'm facing in changes the hue. And then the distance from the center indicates how much saturation. So if I drag closer to the center, then the saturation will drop. So near the center is the least amount of saturation, and then towards the edge of the circle is the most amount of saturation. If I only want to change the hue but not the saturation, I can grab this knob at the outer edge and use that to drag. Might be easier to visualize if I pick a spot in the middle here. So now if I grab this outer knob, you can see I'm rotating around the various hues without changing the amount of saturation. So that could be a good way to fine-tune your hue without having an impact on saturation. There's some nice keyboard controls that come with this as well. If I hold down the control key, you'll see that a circle will appear, and that's another option that allows me to change the hue without having a change on the saturation. If I hold down the shift key, then a line appears from the center to the outer edge, which is a constraint that allows me to change the saturation but does not change the hue. So I can stick with a single hue without having an impact. In fact, if you click and drag, you'll see that that line, a softer version of that line appears. And if you stick close to it, then it'll still kind of keep you constrained. But if you move off of it enough, then it finally breaks, and then you can select a different hue. But if you want to be constrained, just hold down the shift key and you can use that to change your saturation. If I hold down the alt key, that gives me a finer grained control. So the movement of my mouse, which you can see is represented by this orange circle moving away, is much greater than the amount of impact that I'm having. So use the Alt key for fine adjustments for the hue and saturation. If I right click on the wheel, then I can have some options to reset. So I can reset just the wheel that I'm on. I can reset the three-way wheel, or I could reset all ranges. So I've got nice choices there. If I want to sample what I'm working on and get a feel for how much of an impact I'm having, especially if the color grading you're doing is very subtle, then you can click on this eyeball in the right side of the panel. And what that does is that holding that down temporarily disables the color grading, and then releasing allows you to see it. It's just nice that you hold it down, and then when you release, then you can see the effects again. So that's kind of a nice tool. Another option you have for changing the values is to use these boxes, the hue and saturation boxes. So I could click on those and type a value in. So I could just type a value if I knew what I wanted, say 180 and a saturation of 50. That would give me a specific value. So that's a good way to get those. You can also double click these values, just like the labels, just like other areas of Lightroom. You can double click to reset those. And then down below, there's a luminance option, which allows you to affect the brightness of the impact you're having. So for example, if I apply a color grade here and increase the luminance, you can see that it will get brighter and darker. So you have a tweak as well. So you have the full sort of HSL variations that you can do with your color grading. You've got the hue, the saturation, and the luminance. Another option that you have here is this little caret that you can use to toggle showing sliders, and what that does is that'll replace those entry boxes with sliders. And then if you prefer this method, then you could use sliders to set your values. You could use the hue to move around the circle. You could use saturation to move back and forth, and you can also enter values here as well. So you've got both choices, and then you can also click on the value and drag as well. So you've got lots of different ways to make adjustments to the hue and saturation, and then the luminance slider still remains, and you can still make adjustments with the luminance slider. These also, you can double click to reset the values. Just double click the labels if you want to reset the values to their default state. Another nice option is this. If you look at this swatch on the left side of the panel, it says click for color presets. If I click that, then I get this little panel which comes with a variety of preset colors that I can pick, these little swatches here, and an eyedropper. So if I click one of these custom values, let's say I pick the blue, then you can see it will select this blue value, and you can see the impact that that has on the image. So that's nice. I can select yellow, So you could, and then you can change these by right clicking, and there's the selecting, which is the same as the left clicking. You can set one of these swatches to a different color, or you can reset them. So if you have particular colors that you use all the time, then you could set these swatches to match those colors. Another thing that you can do is use the eyedropper. If you click and hold the eyedropper and then drag out into the image, now you can sample any color within your image and use that as part of your color grading. So for example, if I wanted to pick this brick color, I could roll my cursor over here, release, and then I look over at the color wheel, and then that shows me the color that was selected. The next thing I want to talk about is blending. That's this slider that exists here. Let's go back to our grayscale image, because this will give us a good idea of what blending is. Blending is the amount of overlap that will exist, the amount of gradation that will exist between the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. If we drag to the right, this will maximize the amount of blending. You'll see that the green color stretches more into the highlights and more into the shadows, and that the blue color stretches more into the midtones, and this yellow color stretches more into the midtones, because I've got the blending maxed out all the way. If I take blending all the way to 0, then it sort of isolates the colors a little bit more. You can kind of see some more distinct bands here. As the gradation is minimized, the shadows are mostly blue, the midtones are mostly green, and the highlights are mostly yellow. So blending is how much gradation you want between each of those three, and you can adjust that in suit to taste. Balance is similar to the balance that existed in the split toning feature before. So it balances the impact of the midtones, highlights, and shadows, and which one has dominance. If you slide to the left, then the shadows will have dominance, and you'll see that the blue color extends all the way into the midtones and really pushes down the midtones and the highlight values. If I stretch to the right, then you will see that the highlight color has the dominance. So the highlight color of yellow pushes all the way through the midtones and starts to get into the shadows, and it really compresses the amount of color that the midtone and shadow colors are selecting. And then of course, if we go towards the middle, we're going to see more of a balance. So you can use balance and blending to have an impact on how the color grading will work on your image. The final option that we have here is the global adjustment. So if I select global, then I will be presented with a single color circle, and any change that I make to this circle will have an impact on the entire image. If you want to simply apply a single color to a specific image, actually you can use it in addition to the other options as well. If I go to the highlights and make the highlights yellow, you can see there's now a bit of a yellow tint here, and then I go to global, I can still make global adjustments as well, and those will exist. In addition to separating out your color grading by shadows, midtones, and highlights, you can also apply the color values to the entire image globally using the global option. This is actually a great way to apply toning to grayscale images. So if I go up to basic and I change this image to black and white, so now I have a monochrome image, go back to my color grading, and now if I want to make an adjustment to this image, I could add a sepia tone. So you can do that right here within color grading. One of the nice options that exists here is to be able to copy and paste settings between different images. So for example, if on this image I adjust the shadows, and I find a value that I really like for the shadows, a nice cool blue, and I want to apply that to other images, I can right click on the color wheel, select copy settings, then I can switch to another image, click the wheel again, and select paste settings. So this will paste the value of the color wheel that is selected. It only copies and pastes with the single wheel that you have selected. It won't copy all of the values. So if you want to copy all of the values, then you can use the copy and paste button from the lower left-hand corner, hit copy, and then make sure that you've check none or check whatever you like, and then select color grading and process. And then by selecting color grading here, you can then copy and then use the paste option to paste all of the color grading settings to another image. Another nice thing about the color grading is that it is supported by presets. So if I go to create a new preset, click this plus in the preset panel and hit create preset. So now if I go to create a new preset, then color grading is now available. And so now I have the option of taking any of the color grades that I did to this image and applying them. If you find you have a particular style that you like that you want to apply repeatedly with color grading, then you can create a preset, or you could try a variety of styles to allow you to quickly apply a variety of color grades to different images. So presets support color grading just like all of the other settings in Lightroom. So let's talk about the one feature that I think is missing from color grading grading in Lightroom. And that's not a feature that may be necessary for color grading, but it's a feature that would be really valuable for color correction or color balance. And that's an auto option. Having used the automatic color balance capabilities in other programs like Pixelmator is a great example, it does an amazing job of automatically selecting what it thinks the color grade is. Now, of course, you can tweak it after you've done an auto setting, but the auto setting was really impressive, especially when working in infrared, where sometimes the colors could be really tricky. You know, it's pretty easy to make colors look fake and overblown in infrared. That automatic color balance was a really nice way to give you realistic colors that you could then work into your image. Adobe's spending a lot of time now on sky replacement and, you know, all of this other stuff that I have no interest in, but it would be really great if they could spend some time using some of that artificial intelligence to examine how you could automatically apply color grading settings or color balance corrections to an image. All right, so let's take a look at some actual infrared images and see what we can do with the color grading option. The first thing I want to do is focus on what I consider to be sort of additive color grading, the cinematic look. So how can we add colors to an image to enhance it? So first of all, we'll start with this infrared image. I'll go into the basic panel. I will pick up my LUT-based profile so that I can get a quick color swap and give me some flexibility with the white balance. I'll click the white balance picker, and then I'll click the clouds to give me good white balance. So now I want to get into color grading this image. So let's go down to color grading. You have applied blues to the shadows, and then you go to the highlights and you apply some kind of an orange or yellow tone to the highlights. So I've got a color here, and then I'm going to go into the midtones, and this is where I want to sort of get more creative. So I'm going to pick a spot midway up from a saturation perspective, and then I'm just going to go around the circle and kind of explore, because the midtones will have the most dramatic impact on an image. And so I want to see what kind of a look I want to go for here. I think I like something in this teal side here, but now I want to maybe go back to, actually I'm going to drop down. I'll use the shift key to drop down the saturation on the midtones, so it's not much of an impact. I'll go back to highlights and maybe increase the amount on the highlights. Use this outer knob to drag it a bit. Let's just check the luminance on each of these and see how much of an impact that has. Dropping the luminance a little bit helps give me some contrast. That's kind of nice. We'll go to the midtones and maybe drop that slightly as well. And then in the highlights, see what that does. Drew too much on the low end, so maybe a little bit of a bump. So you can use the luminance option to create a little bit of additional contrast in your image as well. So that's a really good example of what you can do to creatively add a mood or a feel to your infrared image by adding colors in the shadows, midtones, and highlights using color grading. Let's look at another example that would be more of a color correction example, more of a color balance. So if I go to basic and I pick a profile for this image, and then we'll set a white balance. We'll set the white balance here on this building. So I've got this really nice image, but one of the challenges that I have with this image is that when I want to pump up the saturation and get some really nice colors out of this, they look really good. You know, the foliage and stuff looks really good. But there's this cast that exists, this color cast of yellow that exists within the house that I'd like to get rid of. So I can diminish that. So let's go into the color grading. And I'm going to probably go after the midtones here because that's where I think these shades are. So we'll go to the midtones, click the swatch, highlight the picker, drag over to the image, and I'm going to pick on this pillar here in the white. And you'll see that this pillar, which clearly should be white, is giving me a hue of 36, saturation of 11. So there's definitely some color that's happening there. If I add 180 to this to give me the exact opposite, so that's going to be 36 plus 180, which is going to be 216, then I can then negate that color out. If I wanted to do the same thing for the shadows, I could click shadows, grab the picker, grab something darker. Let me grab this, the window thing next to the window, which I've suddenly completely forgotten the name of. I'll grab that, and then that gives me there's a lot of color there, and then a hue of 40. If I negate that by adding 180 to it, that'll be 220. And you can see, wow, that has a big impact. So that really neutralized that color cast that existed in the center of the image. And I can use this eye picker to look at the impact before, after, or I can use that, and that'll just affect the one wheel, or I can click the whole panel on and off. So there is the before I've done any adjustments with color grading, and there is after I've done adjustments with color grading. So I think that yes, this is great for color grading, but that's me doing air quotes, by the way, when I go color grading. But really, I think the real benefit of this tool is going to be in doing some subtractive color balance work as well. Okay, one final image to look at. So this is a infrared image I shot at 850 nanometers recently. So let's take a look at using the global option to add some color to this image. So we'll go to basic, and I'll just convert this to black and white. And then I'll go down to color grading, and on the right-hand side, I'll select global. So this will give me the global adjustment. And then I can start dragging around and see what kind of a look, a feel I want for this particular image. So something here, probably going to end up something more subtle like this. And this is another area where this eye clicker or hider tool can be really helpful. So if I click that, I can see before and after, before and after. So that was a look at the new color grading panel in the latest version of Lightroom. Not only is this a great tool for color grading your images, but I actually think it can be useful for color balancing or color correcting your images as well. If you find these videos helpful on your infrared photography journey, please consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a comment. Do you have any topics related to infrared photography that you'd like to see addressed? Leave a comment below. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks.